We go to a lot of trouble in the United States to detect and deny purchases of firearms by certain categories of people, as you all know. Most of these categories are based on a belief that the members are at an unacceptably high risk of committing firearm and violent-related crimes. Such policies give rise to lots of questions, and we're going to touch briefly on 3 of them today. The first is, do the existing denial criteria actually cover the population at risk? Number 2, how often do persons who have purchased firearms legally after passing a background check subsequently become ineligible to possess the firearms that they've purchased, in most cases because of a criminal conviction? And finally, and most importantly, do these policies work? Do they actually reduce risk for violent and firearm-related crime among those who are directly affected? Hang with me, we're going to move fast. So first off, let's just remind ourselves what those prohibitions are. You can't buy or keep a gun if you're a felon. You can't buy or keep a gun if you are a controlled substance addict. Lots of definitional problems here. There is no statute controlled substance addict. Various creative solutions apply. And note that alcohol is specifically excluded from the list of controlled substances. That's a big problem, and someone might want to ask me a question about alcohol later. You can't buy a gun if you're nuts, and we'll leave the definitional problems for another time. The more recent edition, I'm an ER doc, I'm sorry, I talk like that. You can't buy a gun if you've been convicted of a DV misdemeanor. Other violent misdemeanors are fine under federal law. DV misdemeanors not so much, or subject to a restraining order, and you've seen the others at the bottom of the list. It's also important to remember that, as has been alluded to, as a practical matter, these prohibitions only apply to sales by licensed retailers. If you're prohibited and you know it, in most of the country, you just buy from a private party. It's still illegal, but nobody's asking. First question. Do the prohibitions cover the population at risk? I'm going to briefly review 3 cohort studies, all done in California. The first of about 6,000 people who purchased handguns, who passed a background check. These are purchases from licensed retailers, and with the exception of that, the DV misdemeanor exclusion, these people purchased firearms, handguns, under the criteria that apply under federal law today. I'm going to introduce you to a format here and use it repeatedly. On the left here, we are going to be looking at categories and subcategories of handgun purchasers. We're going to be looking at outcomes across the right. In this case, over a 15-year period of follow-up, we're looking at 2 groups: gun purchasers with no prior arrest history, no record whatsoever, and those with at least 1 prior misdemeanor conviction, taken as a group. We'll break it down in just a moment. We're looking here at simply the percentage arrested over 15 years of follow-up. In those with no prior criminal record, about 10% arrested, 2.5% charged with a violent crime index offense, murder, rape, robbery, aggravated assault. For those with 1 or more prior misdemeanor convictions, violent or nonviolent, half arrested, a quarter charged with a new violent offense, 1 in 6 with murder, rape, robbery, or aggravated assault. We'll shift now from percentages to risk ratios. They're described here as relative risk, but risk ratio is a good term. A risk ratio of 6, let's say, means that the group I'm interested in, as compared to some referent group, is at a 6 times increased risk for whatever it is we're looking at. We're going to use that model over and over again. So our outcome here, relative risk of an arrest for an offense by type. The referent group is that none line you saw earlier, handgun purchasers with no prior criminal record. We are looking here at subgroups of those with prior criminal convictions broken out by whether they have 1 conviction or 2 or more, and then by the nature of the conviction. So the top 2 rows here, people who have 1 or 2 or more convictions, but all of their convictions are for offenses that do not involve guns, G-, and do not involve violence, V-. So for those with only 1 prior conviction, and that not involving guns or violence, petty theft, let's say, risk increased by about 6, and you can read these numbers across. To go all the way down to the bottom row, those with 2 or more prior convictions for a violent offense, people who can still legally purchase a firearm in most of the United States after passing a background check, an approximately 11-fold increase in risk for arrest overall, 15-fold increase in risk, 15 times as likely to be charged with murder, rape, robbery, or aggravated assault. Note also, it's not always there, but it is sometimes a term that's been used once already, there is apparent here sometimes what we call a dose-response effect. That meaning that the risk ratios for those with 2 prior convictions in this case are generally higher than the risk ratios for those with just 1. Next question. How often do people who have purchased firearms legally then become prohibited from possessing those firearms? Another cohort study, again in California, but this time the rules have changed. By this time, California has made almost all misdemeanor violent crimes, convictions for those crimes, grounds for prohibition. So there are no violent misdemeanants in this study population. There were in the population a moment ago, and our third study will speak to that transition. Same basic setup. A whole bunch of people who purchased handguns. Some have a criminal record, some do not have a criminal record, some do. Follow-up for 5 years in this case. And our outcome is not an arrest, but a conviction for a crime preventing the purchase or possession of firearms. These people have become prohibited persons. They've not been charged with a prohibited offense. Same layout over here, the no prior arrests, and we're looking here at just 1, 2, and 3 or more prior convictions, and by now you've read the rest of the slide. Approximately 1% of those with no prior arrest record become prohibited persons under both California's now stricter criteria and the federal criteria. Those with 3 or more prior convictions, 7 to 8%. Sounds like a small percentage, but we do process background checks for millions of discrete purchasers per year in the United States. This small percentage of a very large number is a very large number, and with very few exceptions, we as a country do nothing about this. Talk to me a year from now, and I'll talk to you about efforts to recover firearms from prohibited persons. Finally, does all this stuff work? I talk about this some in the handout, and the chief author of the study is speaking right after me and can respond to anything I have to say at this point. It is, I think, fairly well established that the Brady Act does not affect population-based rates of firearm-related violent crime. The evidence is for homicide. I expect the same effect applies across the board. That chiefly, I believe, is because the Brady Act, as a practical matter, does not reach the 40% of purchases not made from FFLs, but that's a separate topic. We are now going to look at a policy experiment conducted in the state of California, but importantly, we're looking at data for individuals. As I mentioned, California broadened its denial criteria. We took advantage and took a look at 2 groups of handgun purchasers. Everybody in both groups had a violent misdemeanor conviction. Everybody in both groups sought to buy a handgun. The difference between the 2 groups, our referent group purchased handguns under the old criteria. The treatment group was denied. Denial is the treatment. They sought to purchase guns in the first year the law had changed. As it happens, the 2 groups were extraordinarily similar demographically and in all other, got to point at it, all other ways. And here's the chief outcome. We are looking here, again, at relative risk. I've put in the confidence intervals because we're getting a little bit close to 1. Over here, we have the characteristics of the group. This is for all the subjects in the study, and I have cherry-picked just to highlight, but the results are sort of the same across the board. Some subgroups, those among whom absolute rates of arrest were highest, those at sort of the bottom of the severity pyramid, those with a prior history of guns or violence. And what you see here is that the purchase of a handgun, in this case, was associated with a 30 to 40% increase in risk of arrest over our period of follow-up for offenses involving firearms or violence, but there's no increase in risk for offenses not involving firearms or violence, a specificity that we argue shows or is consistent with the interpretation that these findings, these results are due to the impact of the law and not some more general effect. So I will sum up, and as you're reading that, I'll just mention that I will yield the balance of my time to the distinguished representative from Chicago.